Hi, everyone. I'm McKenna Jordan. I'm the owner of Murder by the Book in Houston, Texas. And I am happy to be back this afternoon with another virtual event. We are so grateful to those of you who watch these and tune in. And we're especially thankful to the authors who take time out of their schedule to be with us to talk about their new books. Today, we are going to have Kate Weinberg and M.L. Rio discussing their books. Kate's new book is The Truants, and it's brand new in paperback this week. And then M.L. Rio is the author of If We Were Villains, which was one of my favorites a couple years ago. I just want to talk about a couple upcoming things. I can't believe we're turning the calendar to February very shortly. And next week we have a pretty stellar lineup. We have Elle Cosimano in conversation with Megan Miranda, Jane Harper in conversation with Greer Hendricks, Kate Moss in conversation with Anthony Horowitz, John Hart in conversation with AJ Finn, Michael Carita in conversation with Sandra Brown, and topping that off, we have a panel of, I believe, 5 Texas cozy authors on Saturday afternoon. So you'll be seeing a lot of us next week, and just check the events calendar for all that information. Also, I want to add, as I've been doing for all of these, that if you aren't familiar with Murder by the Box, that is our new subscription plan. You can find out more details about that on murderbythebox.com. If you have any questions for the authors, I'm going to let them chat for a little bit, and then I'll be back on here to pass along those questions. If you're watching on YouTube, you can put them in the live chat. If you are watching on Facebook, just pop them in the comments. Okay, enough of that. Let me go ahead and get to the introductions. So, Kate Weinberg. Hi, Kate.
Hi, Beth.
Was born and lived in London. She studied English at Oxford and creative writing in East Anglia. She has worked as a slush pile reader, a bookshop assistant, a journalist, and a ghostwriter. The Truants is her first novel. How are you today?
Very well. It's lovely to be with you. It's in the evening for me, so I've got a glass of beer.
Perfect. I still have my iced coffee here next to me. I'm running behind on having it, so we're in different places, but we'll have fun with it. All right. We're also joined by a guest moderator and in conversation author. We've got M.L. Rio here. Hi.
Hi. How are you guys doing today?
We're good, thank you. So M has worked in bookstores and theaters for years and is currently pursuing her MA in Shakespeare Studies at King's College London. If We Were Villains is her debut novel, and as I said, one that I was a big fan of a couple of years ago when it came out. We're so happy to have both of you here, and I am going to go away and let you chat. Have fun.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, Kate, I am so excited to be here with you and have a chat about The Truants, which I enjoyed so much, and I got a chance to read it early and felt very lucky. Would you be willing to maybe read a little bit to us to give our audience a sense of what they can hope to sink their teeth into when they open your book?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to read a very short passage from right near the beginning of the book, so you don't need to know anything. I'll just dive straight in. I can tell you the exact moment in the recording when Lorna walks on stage. There was no heating, I remember. Or perhaps it was broken, so everyone was wearing hats and gloves inside and grouching about the cold. I can hear Nick offering me his coat, Georgie noisily opening a bag of sweets. Then about 20 seconds in, the rustling ceases. The silence becomes deeper, more intent. And I know why. We're all watching the figure walk into the spotlight, run a hand through her hair, smile down at us as if she's surprised to find it's a full house. We're all here today because of one woman. A pause. She must have raised a copy of the book above her head to show us. If you haven't read her, then I'd strongly recommend you bugger off now and get warm somewhere else. An amused hum from us, her audience, a little release of tension, a settling back into seats into the palm of her hand. This is the campus star. We're going to get our money's worth. And then she's off, and this time she strikes a different note, brisk and purposeful. If you can't keep up with me, then it's not you I'm talking to. Who, Lorna asks, her voice suddenly a challenge, should we call the criminal? The person who commits a crime, or the one who tricks another into doing so? Is it ever valid to take justice into one's own hands in order to prevent other more dreadful crimes from happening? Could you, if the right sort of pressure was applied, kill someone? At this point, if I whack up the volume to the point just before the sound quality begins to break, I think I can hear it. Alex steady breathing beside me. In, out, in, out. If I close my eyes, I can feel the pressure of his thigh as he shifts forward in his seat, drawn as we all are to the figure on the stage. Then he leans into my side, his face a few inches from mine, and whispers something. Can't hear you, I whisper back. He leans even closer, his warm breath chasing down my back. I said, and he must have put his lips right up close to my ear, because the speaker doesn't pick up anything at all. Lorna's voice continues. I know the words by rote, and yet I don't hear them anymore. Because although I don't remember what it was he said, I am back there, back on those unforgiving seats, amidst the strong smell of eucalyptus as someone nearby sucks a cough sweet, with Alex's smile in the dark, and my heart banging with one repeated question. Do you feel it? Do you feel it? And I stay there, well after the applause dies, and there's just the scratchy sound of my phone as I fumble to switch it off in my pocket. Back there, back then, a place I want to be, dancing along a line of heady taboo possibilities, rather than here, now, sitting amidst the rubble and debris of the whole awful thing. I press rewind on the file and start listening again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I love how from the very beginning of this book, the whole story is sort of animated by these two really powerful female presences of Lorna and, of course, Agatha Christie. And I was wondering if you could maybe start us off talking a little bit about what drew you to Agatha Christie as sort of the haunting presence of this novel. What drew you to her, and how did this story come out of her work?
A haunting presence is put beautifully. I can actually remember the exact moment when I fell in love with Agatha Christie. Because I was only around 11 and I'd read one book of hers. I'd read The Sleeping Murder, and I was asked in an English oral exam to choose a subject to do some research on and speak about. And I chose Agatha Christie because I'd just read one of her books. And as I was researching, I discovered the story about Agatha Christie herself, this incredible mystery in her own life, about these 11 days where she had gone missing herself. And this mystery that was never really quite solved. We know that her husband had been unfaithful. We know she was brokenhearted, but she really shut up about it. She never spoke about it again. And I just remember being mesmerized by this idea, which seemed to come almost like from a book itself, the idea of the crime writer who disappears in her own life. And that was, I then went on and devoured the whole of the Agatha Christie canon, but that idea particularly of Agatha Christie and the mystery in herself was just something that I found very compelling. And if you've read my book, as well, I know you have, that's the thing that really follows through the story, this idea of what drives someone to go missing in their own lives.
I love that phrase, to go missing in your own life. And I feel that that's a very apt phrase for much of what occurs in this novel. And this is something we've talked about a little bit between the two of us, how the campus novel occupies this sort of strange liminal space in life between adolescence and adulthood. And what that has to do with this affiliation between the university experience and the criminal experience and how much overlap there is there. So I wonder if you could maybe speak a little bit to how this genre felt like the right vehicle for a story about Agatha Christie.
The campus genre.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I enjoyed thinking about this actually when we started speaking about it, because as you say, this liminal space is really well put. And it's just this period in your life where I, for one, was I was seeking to find myself. I was looking to push boundaries and go to extremes. And so it is actually a really good setup for a crime story, because you're so intent on forging yourself on kind of creating an extraordinary version of and perhaps kind of discarding the previous you, that anything can happen. And it also struck me actually that one thing about academics, both students and teachers, is that they're so unaccountable. They've got so much time on their hands. You know, if you're a bus driver, you know, it's harder to find an alibi, whereas if you're a student or a teacher, you can commit any number of crimes, and you're no one's going to say, where were you at 3 o'clock on so and so afternoon, because you were most probably sleeping.
Yeah, absolutely. There is this strange tension in the sort of university environment where all of this work, it's sort of a rarefied atmosphere where everyone is theoretically doing this deep intellectual work. But as you say, there is a lot of unstructured time. There's a lot of unstructured time that I think absolutely sort of gives way for the kind of experimentation you're talking about, especially with young people kind of on the cusp of adulthood, maybe leaving home for the first time and rediscovering who they are as people. And I loved what you said about extremity, the idea of this genre and literature in and of itself being interested in this idea of passionate extremity, because that's something I write about quite a lot in Villains, but how this pertains particularly to murder mystery, I find really, really interesting. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about this idea of a crime of passion that sort of informs this whole novel.
Yeah, so, well, funnily enough, it goes back to Agatha Christie and this idea that there was an emotional crime in her life. That, you know, here she was, the queen of crime, but this thing had happened in her life between her and her husband. He had betrayed her. He'd run off with a friend of hers, someone she knew right under her nose. And this idea that the kind of crimes of the heart can be, in some ways, the most unresolved kind of crimes. And I really liked this idea that, you know, the murder mystery genre is one that normally ties up quite neatly at the end. You know, in your typical Agatha Christie, there is a drawing room scene, there's this denouement, there's normally a detective who tells everyone what happened, who restores order to the sort of chaos that's been created in the society by this crime. And yet in emotional crimes, often those things are not resolved. You know, you don't get to find out who's the villain, and you don't, you know, it's blurred lines, and it's much more of a gray area. So I loved exploring this idea of a kind of emotion, the messiness of an emotional crime in the middle of the neatness of a detective, of the kind of the mystery itself, of the whodunit aspect. And I think you did that beautifully as well in If We Were Villains. I really felt like you were also exploring all of those sort of open-ended aspects of kind of who's in the wrong and who's really the criminal here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think both of these stories, one of the strongest things they probably have in common is this interest in, we've already kind of talked about liminal spaces, but also gray areas, and particularly moral gray areas. And something you did there that I found really fascinating is you listed all these sort of stock characters that you expect to find in murder mysteries and in Agatha Christie novels: the detective, the perpetrator, the victim, the sort of bystanders. And I'm curious if you would agree with this assessment. I feel like in the course of this story, your narrator, Jess, kind of plays all those different roles simultaneously, which is partly what makes her such an interesting character. Is she is at once criminally responsible, but also a victim of circumstance and emotional manipulation by the people around her. And she's also playing detective. But she also never quite gets that closure that you come to expect at the end of a very neat sort of cozy mystery. And it's interesting to see how different readers react to those open endings, because a lot of readers, at least I have found, really resist open endings. But I think that you're actually hitting on something that is more realistic, especially in the sense of an emotional crime, the idea that it doesn't tie up quite so neatly. And that's part of what makes it so difficult, is that lack of closure, and is that lack of precise definition, which is kind of getting back to what I was saying about, I think Jess plays all of those roles throughout the book.
Yeah, listen, I remember finishing your book and reading the last line and putting it down and going, oh my God, that's a good ending. endings really mean a lot to me, and I spend quite a lot of time in the book. There's a sort of meta element where I'm talking quite a lot about how Lorna, the character, is sort of at war with the neatness of Agatha Christie's endings and the kind of tying it up, because in life, as we know, it doesn't happen like that. But the other thing I think is kind of interesting to think about is, you know, you talked about my narrator Jess, who like your narrator Oliver, is in some ways the least dazzling of the group, or at least he perceives himself to be. And Jess also, she's this narrator who thinks of herself as a forgettable character. And I think there's something really interesting when your narrator is not your hero or your heroine, or is not a kind of dazzling character, because my experience is that readers forgive the kind of more dazzling characters for their flaws much more easily than narrators who may not have done anything that bad, who may have made some sort of mundane, rather kind of mundane kind of missteps or morally questionable actions, but the actual you know, the kind of character that fills the screen or the page in books is often forgiven for much more, because there is this idea that there's something romantic in those extremes, that that we as the reader kind of want to follow them by proxy and have a kind of vicarious experience of this very intense life.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that I'd love to hear you talk a little more about is the influence of Lorna and those other dazzling characters, because there are several of them in this novel. Lorna obviously is kind of the most prominent, I think, but also Alex certainly, and even Georgie to a certain extent. They all exert this really interesting influence over Jess, who is such an impressionable character. And I think you do a beautiful job in this novel, kind of blurring the lines of accountability with who is really responsible for everything that goes wrong in this book. And you could potentially make an argument for tracing it back to Lorna, that she's sort of the catalyst of all of it. But I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about those dazzling characters and how you strike a balance between those dazzling characters and these more impressionable bystander characters who tend to narrate these sort of novels. And personally, I found Jess just as compelling as all the other characters, because I think I recognized a lot of myself in Jess, with that longing for an extreme, intense, passionate experience, and maybe looking for it in ways that are not the healthiest. So I'd love to hear you talk about striking a balance and finding the right dynamic between all those characters.
Yeah, I wonder if you had a similar experience to me with Oliver, with that idea of with creating a narrator who you want to have a not particularly steady self-perception, who doesn't really have a very clear view on themselves, because, you know, you're in their head a lot of the time, and like Oliver is quite down on herself. But at the same time, you want to create a character that it's believable that these other more dazzling characters are going to be drawn to them. So it was a real tension. I really, I thought about it a lot, because I wanted the other characters to be, certainly Lorna and Alec, they were the storytellers, you know, they were the ones that you were drawn to like a, you know, light in a room. And Jess wasn't so much, but in her, what I focused on when I was writing her was her observational skills, because I think that in the end, something that I really love, I love in a character when I'm reading a book, is when I see a character that sees really the small minutiae of things and those little moments between people and those little dynamics. And Jess, although she doesn't see herself, she really sees well when it comes to everyone else. Well, sorry, she makes bad judgments, but she sees the little changes in atmosphere, and she picks up on the little dynamics that happen a lot. And that's how I tried to make her special.
Absolutely. And I think that her ability to kind of latch onto and read those very small moments of interaction between other people is one of the things that does make her so compelling as a character. And the fact that she is such a keen observer, but maybe not the best interpreter of what she reads.
Yes,
She tends to kind of leap to either the best or the worst conclusion, depending on, what her kind of what she wants and what her natural inclination is. So I'm curious, we've talked a little bit about the idea of unreliable narrators and being sort of an unreliable witness in your own story. And we've talked a little bit about how Jess plays all these different mystery roles through the course of this book. She is at once victim, perpetrator, and detective. And I'm wondering if maybe both Jess and Oliver as narrators could be referred to as kind of bad detectives. Jess maybe because she's tempted to interpret evidence in order that it suits the theory that she's already formed, and Oliver maybe just because he doesn't notice anything. But I wonder if you'd speak a little bit about Jess and her role as a narrator and how trustworthy you think she is, because that's a question that I often hear from readers, and I'm curious if you've had the same reaction.
Sorry, what was the last bit? What do I think she is?
How trustworthy she is. I wonder the idea of unreliable narration and unreliable witness. I'm curious how trustworthy you think Jess is from a reader's perspective.
Right. So I think there's a type of narrator who on purpose is misleading the reader. Like, if you think of the murder of Roger Ackroyd in Agatha Christie, you are being, there are ellipses in the text and you are being carefully taken through it in order to kind of pull wool over your eyes. And Jess and Oliver, I would say similarly, are not those kinds of unreliable narrators. They're deluded. Their emotions have got in the way of, they're confused by their emotions, and it's meant that the picture has gone a little bit blurry, and also the longing in them that you were talking about. And I, certainly felt that myself. The longing for a mentor and to make connections means that you're a bit of a sitting duck to make bad choices when it comes to those sorts of things. You are you're just predisposed to not see round corners, I suppose. And so that was the narrator that I wanted to develop. I wanted at a certain point during the story for the reader to kind of fall out of step with her and almost want to shake her as they were reading, as they were turning the pages, and say, no, don't do that, and can't you see, and haven't you figured it out yet? And I don't know, was your experience the same with Oliver?
Oh goodness, yeah, I think so. I think Oliver is maybe an unreliable narrator just because of how deeply obtuse he is about himself and also about his friends. Like, there's a lot that Oliver sees and then just kind of doesn't register in the way that I think everyone around him probably would. And I really like this point you make about the influence of a mentor and how the influence of a certain kind of mentor can sort of predispose you to making these sort of mistakes. And I definitely had the experience reading through the Truants and seeing Jess make these mistakes, knowing why she was going to make those mistakes, and wanting to stop her, and at the same time, like, kind of wanting her to make those mistakes anyway, because they're such delicious mistakes, and you just want to see where that goes. I don't know. I think you did a wonderful job kind of conveying the strength of that desire and that draw that people like Lorna and Alec have for her, to the point where even if you're not like me and you're not actually rooting for her to make mistakes, because I understand that that's a weird thing to do, even if you're not doing that, I feel like you've done such a good job conveying how deeply she feels these things, that even if you're not rooting for her to make a mistake that you can see coming 20 miles away, you understand why she makes it. You understand it completely, like that feeling. You and I talked a little bit about this particular image the other day. Do you mind if I mention that line? I said it's my favorite. Okay. There's this wonderful scene where she's sitting with Alec at a bar after a show, and they're very close together, and they have this sort of like forbidden romance, but this chemistry that's bubbling beneath the surface through the whole story. And she looks at him and says, just in a line of narration, "I wanted to fucking eat him." And I just went, Yeah, I get that. I get that. And suddenly I'm going, well, that feels like a mitigating factor. Anything she does based on this is going to be a kind of a crime of passion. And I feel like that's a sort of passion that you can maybe only feel at that age when you haven't made that mistake yet. And you are still waiting for that disillusionment to come.
I'm so happy that you picked out that particular line, because I mentioned, you know, I've got a cousin who's a great reader, and I passed on the manuscript to her at an early stage, and you know, she said lots of nice things about the book, and then she said, you know, there's that line about wanting to fucking eat him. No one thinks that. No one thinks that. And I really wobbled, you know, when you have a good reader that tells you so, I really thought, you know, maybe I've got to take that out. I mean, is everyone going to think that's a weird thing to write? So I'm thrilled that you've picked that one out. But yeah, that's exactly it. She's so in the grip of her emotions. She's so longing for the experience that she thinks she's having, that it's no wonder that you know, she's going to find herself very far down a route of self-deception.
Yes,
before it comes to before she starts to understand how many missteps she's making.
Yeah, you've sort of implicitly connected here this idea of self-deception with this idea of intoxication that we've talked about a little bit. And not just emotional intoxication, but also there's some intellectual intoxication, I would say, and even some substance abuse intoxication that sort of influences everything that happens in both your novel and mine. But one thing that I found particularly compelling about this book is, first of all, the fact that there are a number of female characters in this book. Like the female characters in this book are of such wonderfully dizzying variety and strength that it was such a refreshing reading experience, particularly in this genre, which tends to be so unbelievably off balance in terms of gender ratios of characters, at least. And I found it riveting to see, first of all, to see the mentor character who we're so used to being, a male character, to seeing that just intellectual and emotional force being housed in the body of a middle-aged woman in the character of Lorna. And the other thing I loved about the representation of women in your novel is how unabashed you are about the force of female sexuality and female sexual desire, because we are so buttoned up about that in literature and Western culture more broadly, Western being a very outdated term. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, about particularly your representation of women in this novel.
So, well, thank you for saying that. My the teacher, the professor figure, Lorna, who we're talking about, was actually inspired by a real life teacher that I had when I studied my master's at the University of East Anglia in Norfolk. And I'd actually had this very disappointing undergraduate experience in Oxford, where I'd arrived at Oxford like Jess. I was longing to have this romantic journey of self-discovery, and I didn't at all. And actually, I was, it was this beautiful picturesque setting, and it just didn't really happen. I kept on feeling that I wasn't meeting the right people, or I'd picked the wrong college, and I realized later, that actually it was me that was lost at the time. But when I arrived to the University of East Anglia and to do this MA, I met Lorna Sage, this critic and writer herself. And she's exactly the kind of woman that you're describing. She was in her late 50s, and she looked a lot older than she was. She had emphysema. She kind of had masses of wrinkles and this terrible smoker's cough, and her kind of hair was sort of thin, and she didn't look particularly well. She wasn't well. But she had these incredible blazing blue eyes and this intellect, and she would just mesmerize the room. And I just remember my brain fizzing in the seminars with her. And I didn't know much about her love life, but she just struck me as this woman who just didn't give a shit. She was very irreverent. She stuck two fingers up at the at the establishment. And when I was writing the Truants, I had a sort of chuckle to myself about the fact that the real life Lorna would have also loved that rather mischievous thing of creating creating a course on Agatha Christie when the rest of the establishment would have found that very lowbrow and irritating. So she was just the kind of person that in so many ways struck me as someone who was so unafraid to be herself in every way. And so there was, I both felt intellectually switched on, but it really was a role model thing as well for me. Mm-hmm. So I really wanted to convey that in the book. And, you know, that's a serious drug to come across when you're in your 20s. And it did have a profound effect on me.
Yeah. So as you were talking about that, I just had a thought that I would love to get your thoughts on. I wonder if these kinds of sort of unconventional female role models, part of the reason they're so compelling for a young woman is maybe because they give young women permission to be kind of messy in a way that they haven't had before.
Yes.
They, you know, getting to see a middle-aged woman who is, you know, has an appetite for food and sex and mess and whatever it is, and seeing that be something that is intoxicating and that is persuasive as a young woman. I can absolutely think of mentors in my life who were like that, who kind of gave me access to a new version of femininity that I had not really seen before as a young woman, and how strangely liberating that was.
Liberating. And often in literature, they're men, aren't they? They're these men who are rule breakers and charismatic, and they kind of look fantastic with their streak of, you know, gray hair in their 60s, and, you know, they're still pulling young girls, and there's something, you know, they're kind of rangy. And with the real life Lorna, and actually a few women I've met in my life who are in that age group, it was not even anything overtly sexual. It was just an appetite for life and a refusal to edit yourself in a way that seemed kind of neat and tidy for the rest of the world. And she had that in spades. You know, she really would come in with her kind of bird's nest hair and just sort of dripping with, there was just a vitality there. And, you know, she didn't feel like age was a chronological thing with her. And that was incredibly inspiring. So obviously, you know, I was writing a murder mystery. I pushed that into all sorts of dark places, because when you have a mentor like that, things can go very wrong too, right? Because they have influence on you, and you're at this very vulnerable time in your life. But my actual personal experience of it was an incredibly positive one.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I want to circle back to something that is kind of related to this, but also related to something we were saying a minute ago. You were talking about the campus novel genre, and this novel in particular, as kind of a form of wish fulfillment. This idea that so many people have a concept of what their university experience is going to be like, and it so rarely lives up to that ideal. And that was certainly true for me. And campus novels give us access to this kind of vicarious experience of intellectual awakening that we all want and so rarely get. And one thing I loved about the Truants was one of the ways that it actually breaks with this genre, or at least the sort of prevailing trends of this genre, where it's not set at a super elite university where everyone is in tweed and looking like they walked out of a J. Crew ad. I loved how you talk about sort of the disappointment of this just concrete campus she finds herself on, and this sort of bleak backdrop of that. And I found it much more realistic in that sense. And you also mentioned that, you know, Agatha Christie is comparatively lowbrow for what we normally see these types of novels written about in terms of their kind of animating literature. And I love that this book takes that and legitimizes it in a really real way. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that compulsion to kind of break with generic tradition.
Well, thank you. Setting was very important to me, and in particular the university setting, which I did based on my experience at University of East Anglia, you know, in real life, I had gone there from, as I'd said, undergraduate degree in this beautiful, picturesque city, and had this unrewarding experience. And then I went and did my master's there, and this campus was incredibly ugly. I mean, it looked like someone had kind of vomited concrete everywhere and it had taken the shape of buildings. It was really bleak, and I liked that. And actually, I had a more transformative experience there than I had at Oxford. So I kind of really like that dissonance. And as you say, in terms of the kind of generic Bridesheadian university settings that we see in films and in books, you know, I did want to disrupt that, and I did want to make it almost painfully ugly. So that was definitely part of my thinking.
Mm-hmm. But at the same time, so you have this contrast, though, between the sort of aggressively, deliberately ugly setting of the university and also these beautiful scenes where they're kind of on this river walk, or the scenes that take place in, is it Italy, when they go to visit Laura? Yes. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that tension between sort of aesthetic disappointment and really sort of dazzling aesthetic beauty that exists in this book.
Yeah, so I wanted that to be part of the extremes that it was trying to hit. And the island that it's based on, this remote Mediterranean island, is also an island that exists that I'd been to, called Filicudi. It's one of the furthest flung of the Aeolian Islands. It's very sort of barren and bleak, but also stunningly beautiful. And I wanted to, I very much wanted to contrast that to the university setting where she's in love, and it's heady and it's exciting and it's ugly, and then to a point where she is thrown totally off center and she's having an incredibly dark, difficult, suspicious time, and it's incredibly beautiful. I wanted those things to be jarring. But yes, you're right as well. The escapade, the truancy. One of the moments of truancy in the novel where they go off to the river setting as well, in the pub. But yeah, I think I just wanted to really play with setting as almost like a presence in I don't know how did you feel that when you were setting up the conservatory?
Oh, absolutely. I think the setting is, as you say, very much kind of a character in the story, and I think that's common with these novels for some of the reasons that we've already talked about. And I think it's we've both I think drawn on real places from our lives and where we've spent significant time to sort of fill in the background of these stories. Yeah, for me, Villains was a combination of sort of different places from my educational experience and my life. The lake was kind of based on a lake at a camp that I went to for years and later worked at as a counselor, which was also a very sort of strange insular experience in the way that these sort of culty academic cliques can be.
Like another locked room. Yeah. Another kind of locked room.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. A very physical locked room of setting, for sure. For sure. So you got into this a little bit talking about the contrast between this really dark experience she's having and this really kind of beautiful place. And so this, I think, is one of the really big questions that comes with this genre is, what exactly is it that forges this association between literature and murder? Why do these two things go so well together? We've talked a little bit about like these extremities of passion, but particularly in a genre like murder mystery, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the sort of fascination that we have with murder, and particularly murder in literature, and how those two things overlap.
Well, yeah, you were talking about it beautifully when you talk about the extremities of passion, but it's also what we were talking about earlier in terms of wish fulfillment, or if not wish fulfillment, a way of proxy living. I certainly felt that I was writing about an undergraduate experience that I didn't have. I sent my character Jess, the narrator character, to she met a bunch of students and a teacher that I hadn't during my undergraduate years, and sort of lived out this very vivid, very extreme experience. And I think that kind of that's the similarity that when you're in literature, you're often you're sort of putting yourself either in a time capsule, or you're making believe a world of choices that you never actually would make in real life. You're just pushing yourself a little bit further. And right at the end of human experience, we were talking about this, is taking another life. And I think it's just that idea of, if you and you're I certainly was, reading English literature and being quite kind of romantic by nature at that age. I saw things, I wanted to kind of push ideas as far as they could go. So I think you are incredibly prey to that as a student, the idea of extremes. And that's what literature does. It kind of it creates this place where you can safely go to dangerous places.
Absolutely. And I think that speaks to kind of the wish fulfillment that we look for as readers. I think has this kind of cathartic element, but also a darker element too, especially in a novel like this, where you are so intimately involved in the main character's thoughts, and so intimately involved with her emotions, that you can sort of understand how she reaches a point where these terrible decisions she makes are possible, and you almost sympathize with her. And I like this idea of competing literary impulses to vicariously experience the joy and exhilaration of being involved in this sort of closed, intellectual, inspiring community, and at the same time, the vicarious experience of getting embroiled in literal murder, and how even that is sort of strangely attractive to us as human beings, to experience that extremity, whether it's an extremity of love or an extremity of fear, an extremity of hatred.
Well, it's you get all the fun of it without the cost, and I think you're right. What you were saying earlier about the fact that you were sort of wanting to egg Jess on to make some of those mistakes. You're sort of rooting for her to make some of those bad choices. It's delicious. It's to kind of to actually journey and experience those screw ups and go to those dark places while you're within the world of the book, and possibly get the learning experiences that you may have done if you yourself had kind of taken such risks, but without the kind of huge wake of destruction that often comes in the path of making extreme choices and pushing boundaries that far. So I think that every writer, every time they sit down to write, they have you have that moment where you're playing God. You get to go as far as you can possibly go. And for me, storytelling and pushing the limits of human experience are the kind of same thing in a way.
I love that phrase, pushing the limits of human experience. And I think that your book does that in a really beautiful way. And it brings me back to your suggestion that Agatha Christie is sort of a lowbrow choice for this, or in kind of in sort of a traditional literary lens, is sort of lowbrow choice for this genre. But I think that's exactly what makes it so compelling, is that literature allows us access to both kind of the highest aspirations of humanity and also our basest impulses, and allows us to, as you say, kind of safely indulge those.
I felt like that. I mean, that was certainly the experience I had with Villains as well, and obviously Shakespeare's the master of that. So I think both with lowbrow and highbrow, the kind of mingling, it doesn't almost seem to matter, I suppose, is the idea that as soon as you're in a story, you get to sort of jump out of yourself and live a different life.
Absolutely. Wonderful. All right. It sounds like we've got some questions from the audience. So we'll turn it back over to McKenna.
Thank you so much. Oh, I think you're on mute.
It's not a virtual event until someone has to say that they're on mute. All right. I have to say, as someone who has a lit degree, an English lit degree, but also owns a mystery bookstore, I was twitching a little with all the lowbrow talk, but that's okay. Well, with Agatha Christie, we won't take it personally. It's okay, Agatha.
My bookshelves are covered with her, and I mean, I meant lowbrow in terms of the way the establishment.
Right.
I absolutely know that. I'm just teasing. It's no problem at all. It was just funny. So we do have some questions. Before we get to those, I actually have a question because we have so many people who watch these events who might be familiar with the authors, but who also might not. And it's been a great in-depth conversation, but actually if you could both tell us, not an elevator pitch, but a quick synopsis of your book so people kind of know what the book is about. So Kate, why don't we start with you?
Okay, so The Truants is about the character Jess. We were talking about my narrator. She's, I guess, a freshman in American terms. She's just come to university and she's followed this charismatic professor, Lorna, and who she believes has sort of written this manifesto for the kind of life that she wants to have, which is an extraordinary life and absolutely the opposite of the very ordinary upbringing that she's had. And she gets embroiled in a romance and a friendship and a mentorship, which becomes a more and more of a tangled web and ends up with a murder in it too. So that's my non-elevator pitch.
All right, how about you, Em?
If We Were Villains follows 7 conservatory students in their last year, and they are acting students who principally study Shakespeare. And it's a very similar sort of story about this group of young people who are embroiled in all of these emotional extremes. And to put it succinctly, their method acting gets a little out of hand and people end up dead.
Fair enough. Okay, so let's see. We have a question. I'm going to pop these up on the screen, but also read them out loud. Would you be open to talking about your writing process? Where do the ideas first start and how do they transform into a manuscript?
Em?
Oh, goodness. The question went away. Is there any chance we can get that back just so I can see it? Thank you. So for me, this idea was sort of born out of my own experience, not the murder part, probably should have specified that. I was a Shakespearean actor for a long time, and when I was a senior in college, I'd been writing for a while and was having trouble really getting anything to click where I felt like it was worth a reader's time. And at a certain point, I kind of looked at all the Shakespeare I was doing and said, wait a minute, okay, why have you never written about this? And sat down and said, okay, if you had a Shakespeare troupe in the room, what personalities would you inevitably encounter in that group? And from there, it's a cliche to say that it kind of wrote itself, but it sort of did. I did about 6 months of outlining to just sort of try and figure out how the story was actually going to go. And I very deliberately did not want to write just a retelling of any one Shakespeare play, because that's sort of been done to death, and like, you're not going to do it better than Shakespeare did in the first place, so bit of a fool's errand. My goal was to kind of instead build a tragedy of my own, kind of based on Shakespeare's tragic structure. So that was how I approached the plot itself of the novel. And from there, it was really just kind of drawing on my own experience in the theater and with different types of people that I had worked with in the theater and what it was like for me to be involved in these kind of small, closed, cultish groups.
Excellent. How about you, Kate?
Well, I should start by saying that my novel was published about 20 years after I planned for it to be published. So I took a very long time to get myself to a point where I was writing something that came together. I had early on in the writing, in the process of trying to create the structure and the plot for The Truants, I had this chance encounter with John le Carré. And I ended up sitting next to him at dinner one evening, and I had made this pact with myself. I thought, whatever you do, do not mention the fact that you're writing a crime novel. Just, the poor man does not need to know this. Anyway, he found me out, and he halfway through the conversation said, when are you going to tell me about this novel that you're writing? And I told him I was struggling. I told him that I was finding that whenever I concentrated on story, I lost the characters, and whenever I concentrated on characters, I lost the story. And he gave me this really pithy tip, which was, he said to me, the cat sat on the mat. That's not a story. Now the cat sat on the dog's mat. That's a story. And so after that evening, I drew a little picture of a cat sitting on a mat that I labeled dog, and I stuck it above my desk. And every time I tackled a scene that didn't have life to it, I tried to kind of up the conflict, which was obviously what he was saying, but also really think about what was driving the cats, what was driving. Years later, when I found out last year, in fact, when I found out that John le Carré was ill, I wrote to him and said, look, you probably don't remember me, but you gave me this incredible lesson once. And I closed the little drawing that I'd had above my desk. And he wrote back and said, your picture really made me chuckle, and said lots of things about the nice things about the book. But he also, it really was my guiding principle, I'd say, and really got me finally through that stage of being stuck to get to paper.
That's a great story. I'm glad we got that story. Mm-hmm. All right. Let's see here. We also have let's see. Are you interested in returning to the campus setting in a future book? But the academic setting, not as a sequel, but an academic setting.
Goodness. Probably at some point. It's not something I have firm plans for, but I'm a person who has worked in academia for a long time. I'm in the 4th year of my doctorate degree now, and will probably stay in that field for a while, hopefully. So I would be very surprised if academia did not make a return in my future work at some point, but nothing specific planned in that regard at this point in time.
Terrific. Let's see. This one is for both of you. Did you find it challenging to write books based around another author's work, with you referencing Shakespeare and Christie? How about we start with Kate on this one?
Sure. No, I think that having Em put it very well when she said that Agatha Christie was a haunting presence in my novel, and actually I found that haunting presence sort of great company when I was writing. You know, whenever I got stuck, I would read a bit of Agatha. I'd try and weave in. There are sort of quite a few clues dotted through the Truants for Agatha Christie nuts and references, and I played with some of her plots and some of her strategies. So no, I think it really inspired me and excited me, and I tried to make sure that I was honoring her and also having a conversation with her at the same time. And no, I feel huge gratitude that I had her there when I was writing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. How about you, Em?
I would mostly just echo that. I think that, Kate, I don't want to speak for you, so feel free to contradict me if this is wrong. But for me, at least, and maybe for both of us, you know, we write these books because we love this literature and just want to engage with it on an even deeper level. And for me, Shakespeare was also very much a write what you know kind of impulse. I was a Shakespearean actor for a long time, and I study it academically now. So Shakespeare was sort of like a second language for me. And there's a line in Villains where Oliver says that Shakespeare kind of lives with them like an eighth housemate, a sort of older, wiser friend who's always there, sort of perpetually out of sight, but never out of mind. And that's been very true for me for many of my favorite writers in my life, and especially Shakespeare. So what I would maybe say is that I think for me, at least, Shakespeare kind of plays the role of mentor that he plays in the book, and maybe the same role that Lorna plays in the Truants, that it feels like if it were real life and not fiction, it might be sort of dangerous to follow their example. But in terms of artistic pursuits, it's a very good role model to have. Absolutely.
And my Lorna character was supposed to have echoes of Agatha herself, so she really was in there as a double mentor almost for me.
Well, and as an Agatha fan, I can tell in the Truants, you know, I it's so fun to see those references, and also my lit degree had an emphasis in Shakespeare, so I love anything that has that, or you know, particularly the authorship debate. I get all into that. So any books with that in there. So it is fun as a reader too. I will say that, like, to have those icons and their work referenced. I think it adds such a nice element to the story. So I will say my apologies. And I said in your intro that you're doing your master's, and since you mentioned your academia, someone has corrected me that you're doing your PhD now. So it's just an old bio. My apologies.
No, it's totally fine. It's a very outdated bio.
Okay, we have a question specifically for Kate. What is your favorite story by Agatha Christie?
Oh, that's you know what? I find this such a difficult one to answer, and I know I shouldn't. I should have something prepared, but can I mention a couple? Evil Under the Sun, I absolutely love. I just think there's a kind of sleight of hand there, and it's this sort of optical illusion almost, with a triangle that you think is one triangle is actually another triangle, and I really played with that in the Truants, so I absolutely love that. But also the other one that I mention, actually a scene of which I recreate as a puppet show in the Truants, is Curtain, and I think that's a really interesting one, and that really goes into the themes of who's culpable in a crime, and are the people who are behind, who exert psychological influence on the criminal to blame as well. So I really love that. I find that kind of endlessly interesting to read and reread.
Yeah, I love that question, because we, over the course of the last 6 months or so, I have led 4 or 5 discussions of Agatha Christie, whether about her missing 11 days, or just the fact that there's been such a renaissance in golden age style mysteries, and this homage to Christie everywhere. And I love that question because everyone has a different favorite, which is, it's so fun for those people who've read a lot of them. It's never the obvious ones.
Do you have a favorite?
Well, so my favorite one to recommend to people who haven't read Christie is And Then There Were None, because I think it's the epitome of what she does, and it was the first Christie I read, and it's just a perfect one-off book. I would say Man in the Brown Suit I find very fun, given that it's more a little bit different. Yeah. And then, oh my gosh, why can't I think of the title of it? Murder is Announced, which is after World War II, and Small Village, and just another excellent one. So, there's something for everyone, really. And you can't not talk about Roger Ackroyd just for how groundbreaking it was, too. So. Okay, let's see. I think this is we have a couple more questions. So, Kate mentioned wanting to shake the characters because they can't see that they're not making good choices. Has it ever happened to you, and with which books? So I guess that's to you, Em.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That I think if you're reading a book and you don't at some point want to shake the characters, it's probably not. That might get a little bit boring. I am always drawn to characters that are complex and sometimes extremely difficult. One of my favorites is, I am a very big fan of Iris Murdoch. I love her, and I love everything she's ever written. And she has a very serious gift for writing extremely complicated and difficult personalities who are just, their drama is delicious. Their personalities are so believable. And she's also been a very kind of animating influence in all of my writing. And yeah, I mean, the entire time I was writing villains, I think Oliver deserves to be shaken pretty much the entire time, as do most of the other characters in that book. If you don't get to the end of villains wanting to murder like a couple of them, then I have not done my job.
Can I add on to that as well, which is Rebecca, Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca.
Yes.
And the narrator in that, oh my God, I just want to take her into a different room and have serious words right at the beginning. So but there's a deliciousness, exactly as Em was saying, about thinking, no, don't make that choice, but at the same time say, go on then, because I want to see what happens. I'm not the one that has to make it. So, but yeah, Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, I read it, I reread it a lot. It's a real influence on my writing, and every time I read it, I spend half the time totally intoxicated with the the atmosphere and the suspense, and the other half the time furious with narrator.
It's so funny though that you know, from the very beginning when you're annoyed, you still read it. Like that annoyance does not make you put the book down. You still want to see what. Yeah,
in real life where you just think, well, I'm not going to make friends with that person. You strangely, you actually want to be in their company and see. That's, you know, that's the magic of good writing, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we've got two more really quickly, and then we'll wrap up. Kind of a partner to, do you have a favorite Christie? And do you have a favorite Shakespearean comedy, tragedy, and/or history?
Oh man, kind of like Kate said, it's a bit like trying to like pick your favorite children. It feels weird to choose favorites in the canon, but I am very partial to King Lear as tragedies go, which will probably not be a surprise to anyone who has read Villains. Let's see. Comedies. I don't do a whole lot of work on the comedies just because I find that they're so much less fun than the tragedies, ironically enough. Let's see. I am very partial to Trillis and Cressida, which many people will say is not a comedy and is kind of a problem play, but I find it delightfully funny. I love the classics, and I enjoy the Iliad very much, and seeing that kind of refigured in Shakespeare's version with a little detour through Chaucer is a lot of fun. Histories. Let's see. Richard III. I love Richard III. I think it's a wonderful play, and it's so rich. And speaking of characters who are evil but delicious, it does not get much more evil or delicious than Richard III.
That is true. Okay, last question, and it seems appropriate that it's about ending a novel. How do you know when it's time to close the curtain on a book?
Ooh.
You go first, Anne.
Oh gosh.
I've dropped you in that.
That's a very good question. I think a good place to end a book is when you have answered most of the questions, but there are still enough left open to keep a reader wondering.
That's a brilliant answer. That's a brilliant answer. I'd love that to be my answer too. The only thing I would add to that is there's that saying, isn't there, that the novel's never finished, it's only ever abandoned. And I think there is definitely a moment in the writing process when you realize that you are you're reworking scenes in a way that kind of makes it overwrought and slightly overwritten. And I think I personally, as a writer, I often feel that in my actual hands when I'm typing. They go a little bit heavy. I get a little bit tired, and I sort of think, right, okay, I'm not making myself enjoy it, and I won't be making the reader. So it's a sort of, it's quite an intuitive feeling as well. But yeah, I also would agree. You just want to leave that door open and possibility rather than closure at the end of it.
Wonderful. Okay, so I think that's gonna finish us up for today. As I mentioned earlier, we would love it if you considered purchasing copies of the books through us. We are devoting a lot of time and energy to these virtual events, and it's absolutely lovely to talk to the authors. And like I said, we would appreciate you taking the time to support us if possible. We have copies of both books in stock. Thank you both so much for a very engaging conversation. I know sitting here, when I wasn't involved, I was certainly sitting here enjoying it. I appreciate you spending the afternoon with us. And to those who have watched, same thing. I appreciate you spending the afternoon with us. Check out our schedule for forthcoming events, and we hope to see you again soon. There we go. Perfect. I'm sorry, I don't have them today. I don't know how that happened. I normally have them right here. There. Excellent. Excellent. Display the book. Okay, thank you all very much. You two have a wonderful evening, and I hope to chat with you again in the future.
Thank you
so much.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.